In fact, later this year actually happens to be day after tomorrow we're opening. So to have been talked into doing this talk today took some arm twisting from a couple of people, especially Mario Ferruzzi. We're frantically trying to get everything done, as you can might imagine. My favorite saying for the past 3 months is, we're getting there. And I was on the phone with the dean here a few minutes ago, and I said, we're getting there. So anyway, thanks for inviting me to talk about this topic today. When I started putting this talk together, it was a little bit of a challenge to think about where to go with this, knowing the mission of ILSI and knowing where protein is going today. So I'm taking a little bit different tack maybe than what you might have expected, but we'll see how this all works out. Why protein? Why now? I mean, proteins, we've been around for hundreds of years of talking about protein, the importance to our nutritional being. But all of a sudden, I think the fact that we have denigrated fat and carbohydrate now for the past 2 decades probably has led us down this track towards protein. Now, we've all figured out, well, if it was the carbohydrates and the fats that were all bad for us back then, maybe it's the protein that's really is good for us. So we've seen this blossoming of interest in protein now over the last couple of years. A number of things are driving this change. And number one and foremost, of course, is the consumer. Because after all, they're the people buying our products and rebuying our products. And if we don't satisfy what their needs are, we're not going to be in business very long, correct? So they've started looking at it from the perspective of what can they do to cut their costs in their diet. We talk about beef consumption going down. We looked at the price of a pound of hamburger lately compared to a price of chicken. It's quite a bit of difference in price, and I think some of that has actually driven a decline in our consumption of red meats and pushed up the white meat, so to speak. They're also looking for much cleaner labels. They want things simpler. They don't want to have chemicals on the label. Anything that starts with an X or has an X in it, forget it. Don't have it on your label. They're going to move away from that. And then there's the whole piece now where this generation that we're talking about that has started saying they'll accept technology from the marketplace, they're much more into health and performance than we've ever seen probably in recent years. They tend to get to the gym quite a bit more frequently than some of us. Obviously, I've not been to the gym the past year, building this project we're working on right now. But they also understand nutrition a little bit better. And as we move towards more personalized nutrition, I dare say that the Gen Yers, Gen Zers, and whatever we're calling the latest generation now, are probably going to be the people leading some of that charge. But the other thing that has started pushing the interest in protein, and we've all been hearing these numbers now for a couple of years coming out of FAO and other places, the population growth in the world over the next 20 years, we're going to have at least 9 billion people on our planet by the year 2040. A result of that fast population growth is that our per capita protein consumption is increasing very rapidly in Asia and North Africa as they've discovered that they like the taste of protein, which results in us needing 40 to 70% more protein to meet their needs. Notice I said protein and not plant-based protein. All protein is going to be important as this population grows, and we're going to have to look at protein from a number of different sources over the next 10 to 15 years. So we have to pull out all the stops and start looking at it today. Why do processors really add protein to food formulations today? Let's get beyond the milk. Let's get beyond the steak cut or other forms of pure protein, as we call it. And why do we formulate with it? There's 3 very real reasons. First one is physical functionality. Physical functionality really comes back to impacting the appearance of the food. So it's got emulsifying properties, it's got foaming properties, it's got gelling properties, water and oil binding. Color is contributed by proteins in a lot of cases. Taste. If you've tasted a lot of the plant-based proteins the past couple of years, taste, get the hint. Smell. Actually, proteins do have a unique smell. So we also look at it from a flavor perspective because they do contribute some sweetness and some saltiness. Aspartame, of course, was a peptide, so it contributed to sweetness. A lot of people now frantically looking for the next salt replacer. They've looked at a lot of peptides from a perspective of being able to supply the saltiness, accentuation of flavors, or even damping of flavors. And then there's the texture piece of it. The water binding and the protein gelling and protein viscosity building on its own really contribute a lot to mouthfeel. The consumer, it's interesting, they talk about taste a lot of times, but they also come back to, I don't like the mouthfeel of that. Think about mushrooms, for example. You ask people, probably people in this room, how many of you like mushrooms? How many of you don't like mushrooms because they feel slimy in your mouth? We got a few, okay? So that's what we mean by, what's the texture reaction. We get that with proteins too. Because if we build too much viscosity with a protein, for some segments of the population, it's very difficult for them to swallow, especially older patients or older people. And then there's powder characteristics of dispersibility, wettability, and then flowability. But there's also the nutritional value, and I call that the physical. Beyond the physical, it's the nutritional value that we also look at. And the physiological functions. Physiological functions really talk about the bioactive or the phytonutrient quality of a protein. Improved short-term memory, improved long-term memory, lower PSA counts for older gentlemen, improved cardiovascular health, reduced PMS symptoms, and then better bone health. All of these things have been proven to be impacted by peptides arriving from whole proteins. So as we start looking at some of the major alternative protein sources over the next decade, which was really what we're kind of charged with to speak about today, there are certain key requirements that I want to talk about over the next few minutes with this slide, because I think a lot of these are key to what we'll be seeing in the future. And the first one is really an adequate supply chain. That supply chain has got to be able to provide kilotons of product and materials to be used in food formulation. So a good example of this, we've had proteins around we've been formulating with literally since the 60s. Dairy proteins grew because they were a byproduct, especially whey protein products. Soy products came out of the soy meal industry as we had pressed out the oils. So we had soy protein products appear. Well, the big craze today, of course, is Beyond Meat, the Impossible Burger, and a half dozen other new products that have come out as meat alternatives now based on plant-based proteins. And for the most part, they're using one protein, pea protein, right? So 5 years ago, pea protein wasn't on anybody's radar. It wasn't on anybody's radar, including the farmers. Those are the people that need to be growing the products so that we can supply the supply chain that fulfills the orders for those proteins. So over the last 5 years, if you look at the number of acres that have been planted now of yellow pea, which is what the yellow pea is what we're utilizing to isolate these proteins to make the concentrates and the isolates out of it, the number of acres being planted has increased rather rapidly, but when you start from a baseline of basically zero, literally 1,000 metric tons 5-10 years ago, to where we're at today, what's now happening is we're starting to outstrip the amount of capacity we have to process that product and to make the pea protein. Now, there's a number of companies out there, and there's some of their representatives are here today, that are in the process of building brick and mortar and stainless steel to be able to fulfill that need to isolate the proteins and then supply them to the industry. At some point, the supply and demand curves will cross. Similarly, other proteins that are being looked at will have a good chance at also being successful in the future, such as chickpea and even canola. Canola is not used today as a protein per se, simply because most of the canola oil that we manufacture in the world is done by hexane extraction. But as we get more involved in cold pressing of canola oil, that meal becomes much more attractive to be used as a raw material to start isolating the protein. The other thing that we have to think about, we're working with living species of products. These plants change year to year. There's seasonal variation, there's genetic variety variation, and when we're talking about proteins from a nutritional value, and we're trying to understand what it contributes to the human being from a nutritional perspective, that variability that we can see season to season and hybrid to hybrid can really create some problems for us as we're balancing diets. And the nutritionists in the room know exactly where I'm coming from on this. The other thing that is starting to evolve a little bit is some of the things with processing. Extraction and processing technology today have to be proven at scale. frankly, I won't talk a lot more probably in this conversation about plant-based proteins. Why? Because we're using the same technology we've been using for 30 years for dairy proteins and soy protein. We've not really evolved a lot yet on the plant-based proteins. We're still doing isoelectric precipitation, or maybe we're using a little bit of ethanol, and I'll talk about some of the other methods here in a few slides. But for the most part, we're using the same technology we have been for 30 years. But there are some things on the horizon, and I'll talk about that shortly. Consumer acceptance of processing also, and I put consumer acceptance here because there's, so let's talk about insect protein for a second. So insect protein has a big ick factor, right? All of us probably, first time we heard about insect protein, we're thinking, not sure I want to eat my nutrition bar with a cricket in it. Well, today's processing has got to evolve a little bit further than the insect, because what they do today is they're basically growing the insect, they're drying it out in the sun or in a dryer, and then they're grinding it up, milling it, and putting it in a bag and selling you as a protein concentrate with a relatively low level of protein. There's not many isolates out there yet. So if you really start examining those products, you might find some insect parts that are recognizable yet. So the consumer's not going to be real happy about that, right? We also have to look at their microbial and chemical stability from a processing technology perspective. So as we start developing new technologies, let's pay attention to the microbial and the chemical composition of the products we're putting together. We have unintended consequences sometimes whenever we start enriching or isolating products, that there are byproducts that come along. Processing also, and I mentioned that word byproduct because it's not just the byproducts we see in the protein product itself. There are other parts of the plant that we're isolating from, or the animal we're isolating from, animal being an insect incidentally, that we have to find a use for. So why haven't pea proteins been more popular before the last couple of years? Because you had this tremendous amount of pea starch coming along with the isolation procedure, as well as pea fiber. The world can only accept so much pea starch and pea fiber at the present time. We haven't found a lot of, let's say, beyond good use for that starch in a lot of food formulations yet. So what do we do with that? It goes the same for anything else that we work with from a protein raw material. What do we do with the byproducts? There's a few people out there that are starting to use distiller's grains and recover protein from distiller's grains. I'll say that a lot fast. The problem there is unless the brewery or the distillery that they're getting the distiller's grains from are very standardized on the hybrids and the grains they're receiving to make their beer or their alcohol from, you again have variants all over the place in the amino acid composition of that finished product. So when people talk about recovering protein from distiller's grains, it's not to be able to go to Handbook 8 to understand what's the quality of that protein necessarily. It's going to be a batch-to-batch variation. Now with distilleries making a fortune on small batching of bourbons and everything else today, maybe we could do something like that in the future with protein. But it's going to be much more difficult until we really get to personalized nutrition. We also have to address the consumer's wants and needs. Which products, the initial products are going to have a strong nutritional and functional perspective, as I said. It's not just about nutrition, it's not just about functional, it's a combination of the two as we put together a protein. And then it supports a path of ingredient and finished product innovation. It's not a one-to-one substitution. If we're using a whey protein isolate in a product today, we can't necessarily use a soy protein isolate. We've seen that for 30 years. Same thing is occurring with chickpea, with pea protein isolate, just go on down the list. And finally, there's some things that are very imperative for success: the texture and the flavor. And I've said flavor so many times today. It's because a lot of these proteins out there have a real astringency, drying effect in the mouth. And we're still trying to understand what's going on, the interaction between the saliva and the protein. Salivary proteins tend to interact very quickly with a lot of these different proteins and give us a weird texture, weird flavor, or at least to the consumer it's detected as weird. And then finally, there's the case of the regulatory. The regulatory path is a major unknown still. Because as we get into some of these, insects being one of them, cultured meat being another protein. There's going to be a lot of questions about what else is coming along with this and how are the regulatory agencies going to handle it. I know some of the speakers later on panels here today and tomorrow are going to be addressing some of that, so I'm not going to go very deep into that. Proteins are evolving in the marketplace, and as I said, there's been some of them that have been around for, some of them have been around for quite a while, so they have an established following. So soy, wheat proteins, even pea and rice to some extent have had a good following now for a number of years. In the next 3 years, we're going to see a lot more with corn protein. Even some more rice proteins are being worked on. Chickpeas starting to pop up a little bit. The key features of these particular products really is they're label friendly and they have some functionality. And all three of these classes have some good water binding, have some good oil binding, emulsification properties. So from a physical functionality, we're very interested. We're just starting to understand the physiological functionality of those proteins. Now, buried within a protein's primary sequence, there will be motifs that have bioactivity. They may be an ACE1 inhibitor, or they may be a powerful antioxidant. Those are the types of properties we have to go after and do the research to discover what they're capable of doing. Where we're building supplies today, fungal proteins. Fungal proteins will continue to grow over the next 3 to 5 years, and I went on record a couple of years ago as saying if I was going to put my money down on anything right now, it'd be fungal proteins, because a lot of things we can do with fungal, and I'll talk about that shortly. Canola, as I said, as we start moving more towards cold pressing as opposed to hexane extraction or any other solvent extraction, canola will start growing. Why? Because if you look at canola proteins, they're a fairly complete protein. They have a very high PDCAS. The emulsification properties, the gelling properties, a lot of the physical functionality that we're after can be met by canola proteins. There may be one class of proteins that's closest to a whey protein isolate as we try to replace animal protein. And then there's the consumer's need, a lot of convincing on, and that's going to take another 5, 7, maybe even 10 years for us to convince that consumer that A, they should eat some forms of algae, they should eat insects, single-cell protein, and the new cellular alternatives that are coming along, the so-called cultured meats or cellular agriculture products. That key feature comes back to sustainability, which is another reason why the consumer has begun looking for alternatives to animal proteins. It comes down to sustainability. It's all fine about the physical functionality, it's all fine about the nutrition, but a lot of us believe that we shouldn't be raising animals for food. And so what's happened now is they're starting to look at other alternatives. So if we look at some of the current commercial processes that are used out there, because this talk is a little bit about the processing for proteins, I looked at 4 big classes here: dairy, cereal and oil seeds, plant-based, and then the meat/eggs. And today, as I said earlier, we're using a lot of isoelectric precipitation. We're using a lot of salt extraction. Ethanol extractions have been looked at for a number of different protein classes, especially dairy and cereal and oil seeds, those plant-based. Rennet extraction is only used in dairy. So if we're looking to make casein, rennet casein, we're using the enzyme rennet, which is also known as chymosin, which is isolated from calf stomach, or now it's a genetically engineered enzyme. Ultrafiltration, diafiltration, microfiltration, and reverse osmosis has been the method of choice to get to isolates. So everybody understand the difference between concentrate and isolate, or do I need to cover that? So typically concentrates are roughly 25, 30% protein, all the way up to about 80, 85% protein on a volume basis or on a mass basis. Anything above 80, 85% becomes an isolate, and most isolates are right around 90% protein. So you have to have that extra step of processing, extra costs incurred. Interestingly, the food industry got very dependent on whey protein isolates and even high protein whey protein concentrates over the last couple of decades. And as the price of meat went up, so did the price of milk products, so did the price of dairy proteins. So they began looking at alternatives. Soy protein isolate was a nice fit to that niche. It could substitute for whey protein concentrates and isolates. The problem was there was some negative press starting to appear on soy proteins. So all of a sudden we were left scrambling as food formulators to begin looking for the alternatives. Pea protein happened to be one of those we've stumbled upon quite quickly, chickpea quickly to follow. Extrusion. Some proteins are actually manufactured by extrusion. Usually they're using a protein as a starting material and adding something like sodium hydroxide to it and ending up with a caseinate, for example. Drying and milling I talked about. Drying and milling has been around for quite a while. It's simply just a matter of growing something or taking something and drying it down and then grinding it to a set granular size and sieving it out and then packaging it off. Enzymatic modification has been utilized also for a number of years to improve usually the physical functionality of the proteins and a little bit to get after some of the bioactives. Now the enzymatic modification that I'm talking about in this particular slide will be different than the enzymatic modification I'm talking about in a later slide. Here we're talking about the trypsin type enzymes, some of the early microbial and fungal enzymes that came out from the likes of Novozymes, Amano, other people. And they were very non-specific in their attack on a protein, so we were getting a lot of different peptides.
Next generation of proteins that are being developed today and will soon be in the market at hopefully at affordable prices. Insects are really starting to get a lot of attention from various manufacturers, and they're working all the way from the larva stage to the adult stage. But for the most part, the insects are being raised and then harvested, dried, ground, and packaged instead of actually isolating the proteins or enriching the protein products. So therefore, what you're really buying is an insect flour that probably contains 25 to maybe 30% protein. Some of these examples, the black soldier fly larvae, crickets are out there, and some of the companies are giving them, they're cleverly named according to the species of insect they're working with. So, for example, with crickets, we have chirps. With grasshoppers, we have jimimies. Fruit fly larvae by flying spark out of Israel. There's still the ick factor. Consumer still hasn't said whether they will accept insect protein in their foods today. Algae continues to be of interest to a number of different companies, and there's a large variety of algae that are now being grown in fermenters or in outdoor ponds for whole cell and excreted products. Again, these are relatively low in protein concentration when they do the extractions. They're not passing them through ultrafiltration or the other methods that we use today to concentrate. You can see chlorella has been a popular one. Duckweed is one that's very popular and being grown in outdoor ponds. Of course, with outdoor ponds, you have some challenges with bugs and other things getting into the ponds, so you still have to clean that up a little bit also. Fungal, growing interest also, especially now that we can grow mushrooms in mass quantities by both traditional and solid state fermentation. They're harvesting them and drying, and then in some cases they're further purifying them. But interestingly, even the dry cell mass of mushrooms contains a relatively high protein concentration. And it's mushrooms we've typically heard of in fine restaurants like portobello and shiitake, oyster, lion's mane. These continue to grow in popularity, and quite frankly, will probably take over for some of the plant-based meat products that we're seeing in the marketplace today. Cellular agriculture, of course, is one of the ones that's become quite controversial and quite talked about in the technology circles. Basically, what we're doing is we're taking stem cells, growing them in a cell culture medium on a scaffolding, allowing the cells to differentiate or basically form a tumor until a meat mass is formed. Some of the big companies out there, Memphis Meats, New Age, Beyond Meat, the fish area, Blue Nalu, shellfish, duck, chicken, all sorts of different products are coming about. Aleph Farms out of Israel is working with hybrid products and meat cells in combination with plant cells. The single protein area has been around for probably about 40, 50 years now almost. Mycoprotein, or the corn product, has been utilized in what was originally the first plant-based meat analogs. They're basically single-cell organisms grown in fermenters and then harvested and dried. Some of the last category I have is sustainable but not new. These are proteins that have traditionally been around for a number of years, isolated by different methods, but today they're being cloned or gene edited into microorganisms, usually yeast cells, to intracellularly synthesize and in some cases then secrete the proteins of interest. So for example, Perfect Day is doing beta-lactoglobulin from milk. Geltor has been working with gelatin. Clara Foods has hit the market with egg albumin. Another little company called Sugar Logic out in California doing human milk oligosaccharides. And then there's Miraculex, who's doing a sweetener. And then there's an enzyme company called Proterra. So if we look at some of the commercial processes used for these emerging proteins, and quite a bit of the what I would call traditional processes, fermentation, genetic modification, genetic engineering. There's some ligand chromatography going on out there, submerged solid state fermentations. You can see where they all fall on, say, algae using fermentation, genetic modification, just starting to use some gene editing, but the solid state fermentation has been around for years. Insects, as I said, they're really growing them, drying them, milling them. Fungal, similarly, they're growing it in a fermentation vat or in a pond, harvesting it and then milling it. Cellular agriculture, cultured meat type products, using fermentation and or tissue cultures. And then the sustainable but not new category, trying a lot of different things. And enzymatic modification I have here is listed as a process, listed as a process, is not your traditional enzymatic modification of taking a protease and breaking the peptide into smaller, or taking the protein and breaking it into smaller peptides. This is actually enzymatic modification to liberate the proteins from the cellular milieu that they're contained in, and then purifying further. Will new protein sources make an impact? Well, there's a lot of strengths with a lot of these new protein sources that we're seeing. They're, the purified ones that have are much cleaner today. So, for example, Perfect Day's beta-lactoglobulin, very nice gelling protein. So it's creating some real novelty out there. Some of them are fairly easy to produce, insect proteins, for example. Better nutritional values. We're actually going after proteins that contribute to human nutrition. And then it actually helps us to meet the future needs for more protein. As we continue to consume large amounts of protein as a society, by the year 2040, we do need to produce quite a bit more protein. Some of the weaknesses with these new protein sources, their yields are not that good, and it costs a lot of money to produce some of them. It's fairly energy intensive. When one looks at the carbon balances on that, you can see where energy costs tend to skew that a little bit. Some of them don't have the same functionalities as let's say, a casein. When you isolate a pure casein, it may not have the same functionality, so it may not gel or it may not foam as well. There are some anti-nutritional factors that come along with it, but the biggest ones are probably the poor colors, odors, and flavors, and certainly the ick factors. A lot of opportunities out there. We can take a lot of these new proteins and put them in animal and aquaculture and companion animal nutrition. I haven't heard a cat or dog yet that can say the word ick, and they'll eat that protein with no problem. A lot of specialized nutritional medical foods also coming out as an opportunity. Some of the threats, the return on investment. We've seen recently in the financial literature that some of the cell ag companies are getting $100 to $200 million to scale up their cell masses. It's an awful lot of money to be invested in a technology that still hasn't shown that it'll be consumer accepted, or frankly that we can even do it yet. So will the consumer be able to afford it in the end of the day, and will they accept it? Again, things we don't know yet, so they pose threats. GMO and genetic engineering, gene editing issues will still be out there. And in some cases, how do we label these products? Some of these products are coming from products that have a standard of identity. How do we handle some of that looking ahead? There's some moral issues out there, still some food safety issues. Allergenicity from new protein sources. Anytime a protein is fed repetitively to an individual or a population of individuals, you're bound to find some people that are allergic to those proteins. So it's a broad claim. It's risky to make a broad claim that you have an allergen-free protein. So as I kind of conclude my talk today, looking ahead, our population growth over the next 25 years is really going to necessitate us to take a lot of actions to sustain an adequate protein supply for feeding all of us. And so some of those points include reducing our overall caloric intake, and then also by doing that, reducing some of the amount of protein that we as Westerners consume. That's probably one of the single biggest things we can do to make sure we have enough protein 20, 30 years from now. We will continue to expand the use of genetic modification and editing. We'll have to increase our fermentation capacity because that's definitely going to be a wave of the future. We'll continue to explore alternatives to traditional protein sources, and it'll go beyond fungi, it'll go beyond algae, it'll go beyond mushrooms, it'll go beyond whatever. So a lot of different things are now being looked at as potential protein sources. And probably the one biggest challenge we have in a lot of the cases, and we've seen this with pea protein over the last couple of years, is Beyond Meat and Impossible Meats continue to launch their products. We really need to develop the supply chains through some agronomic selection, increasing the amount of acreage being planted and discovering new or optimizing existing methods of protein manufacture to improve yields and cost of production. This point cannot be overlooked, as Impossible and Beyond found out rather rapidly as they were looking for pea protein. We really have to improve our supply chains. So with that, I said thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions anybody has.